Whether you love it or hate it, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania is a city that's always taken pride in being a hub for the blue-collar and rugged workers that don't mind getting their hands dirty. Well, the same could be said about Philly's mafia. The city of brotherly love has rarely lived up to that moniker on the streets, as its mob history has painted a different story plagued by major wars between criminal figures and families since the early 1900s, where gangsters in the headlines were no less common than the score from last night's Phillies game. The history of the Philadelphia Mafia has been littered with notorious and fascinating figures from John Stanford to Angelo Bruno. Today we're going to start with one of the first big names to stroll those streets, and that was Salvatore Sabella. Sabella was a key figure in leading up to the first major mob war in Philly, and we're going to find out why. Let's go back to Sicily, where Salvatore Sabella was born on July 7, 1891, in Castellammare del Golfo. In his teen years, he began work in a butcher's shop. Unfortunately for him, he worked for a man who was incredibly violent and ill-tempered. I'm assuming that the abuse from his employer weighed on him, because Sabella wound up taking that man's life. Now, I couldn't find if there was an immediate conflict that led up to this, or if it was just Sabella finally snapping under the constant pressure of a known abuser. But regardless of why, Salvatore was convicted and sentenced to 3 years for the crime, which he served in Italy. That is thought to be the period that Sabella decided to initiate his ascension into organized crime. Soon after prison, he went to New York and settled in Brooklyn. Once he was there, he started running with the Salvatore D'Aquila crew, where he met Giuseppe Traina. Traina took a liking to young Sabella. This led to Traina tailoring Sabella into someone that could be a leader, someone who could head a crew. He saw potential that he wanted to exploit. By 1919, Sabella had proven his worth and went down to Philadelphia to set up and lead operations on behalf of their crime-based organization. He would run fronts to cover their activities, which fell in line with the country's typical crimes during that era, like bootlegging. From there, he added to his body count, eventually being tried for the deaths of Vincent Cocosa and Joseph Zenghi. He was eventually acquitted of the crimes, but it didn't go without punishment as he was deported back to his native country. That was until the Castellammare War, which brought Salvatore Sabella back to the United States, where he took the side of Maranzano against Mazzaria in the conflict. When the war ended in 1931 with the death of Mazzaria, Sabella returned to Philly again shortly after, taking the reins back over from acting boss John Avena. However, that stint was shorter than Tony Soprano's temper, and Salvatore abruptly retired from organized crime. Some believe the Castellammare War took a toll on him, but who really knows? Either way, he got to retire and live out the rest of his life on his own terms, which is unusual for a mobster, because usually there were only 3 variables, being death, prison, or snitching. So kudos to Mr. Sabella for getting out while he still could. In fact, he lived until 1962, where he died from the most unnatural mobster death, being that of natural causes. Sabella's retirement in 1931 was the precursor to the first Philadelphia mob war, because now there was a power grab. So by 1932, the escalating tension following Sabella's retirement was in full swing due to the ambitions of his former lieutenants, John Avena and Giuseppe Dovi, as both had an appetite for power and control. John Avena, once acting boss, was Sabella's one-time underling that was supposed to become the eventual and permanent boss. Avena had been someone that most associates thought fondly of as a foundational piece of the faction. He was someone who built relationships with other ethnic criminal groups, expanding the likes of profit. A true believer of financial progression without barrier. Giuseppe Dovi, also known as Joe Bruno Dovi, was another one of the central figures in the conflict. Though not to contradict what I said earlier, it was kind of murky as to whether Dovi was immediately at odds with John Avena personally for leadership, but it is assumed that Dovi also wanted the role of being the boss. Most importantly, in my opinion though, are the Lanzetta brothers, not Lanzetti, which has incorrectly been given to them through the years. Led by Leo Lanzetta, the crew included his brothers Pius, Ignatius, Hugo, Willie, Lucian, and Tio, who mainly operated out of South Philly. For context, it should be noted that Leo was actually killed in 1925 in retaliation for the death of a different Joe Bruno, who was a rival bootlegger. And Leo's killer was thought to possibly be none other than Salvatore Sabella. Now, the Lanzettas were a volatile bunch of siblings that seemed to have had a beef with basically everyone from other Italians and Sicilians, as well as Jewish gangsters and Irish crews too, and they were thought to have been involved in at least 15 total killings between them all. As the war waged into the mid-1930s, the Lanzetta brothers were ready to turn the tides. They decided they were going to step in and lend the eventual helping hand to Joe Bruno Dovi. They did so on August 17, 1936, by orchestrating a drive-by shooting and assassinating John Avena. This was the turning point that handed the eventual power to Giuseppe Joe Bruno Dovi. Dovi wound up becoming a competent and great successor to Sabella's criminal organization, as he helped expand their rackets into Atlantic City, New Jersey, as well as other places outside of South Philly. That was in fact the beginning of a new era of crime that was coming to Philadelphia under the leadership of Dovi, as by the late 1930s, the majority of the Lanzetta brothers were dead or in prison. The brothers themselves were wild cards. Having them gone along with Avena paved the way for Dovi to expand without caution. Dovi remained boss for a decade, then he passed away of natural causes too. I never thought I'd tell a mob story about a war where at least 2 guys die of natural causes. Personally, I would attest that to not only his luck, but intelligence as well. I mean, to navigate a life of violent criminals and daily deadly business deeds while going out somewhat on your own terms is pretty impressive itself. At least I think so. As for this war, it was far from the bloodiest on the list of the Philly mafia conflicts, but it was a foundation for the groundwork of violence that the future would behold any time there were disagreements and beefs. The Philadelphia underworld has always been one that acted first and sometimes didn't even ask questions later. Instead, it's always been a smorgasbord of trigger-happy gangsters, ready to forecast a storm of bullets at the first sign of any rival opposition. As a whole, I have a fascinating love for the history of the mob in Philly. They've always struck me as the more rebellious families, more so than the already typical mob type. I was always the black sheep of my family, so I can relate a little bit. Anyways, thank you for walking in and falling into this teeny tiny rabbit hole about the first major mafia war in Philadelphia. I do very much appreciate it, and I hope it leads you to more of my content as well as the awesome content from the other crime creators on YouTube. Have a great day.